collaboration. It's a big honor and pleasure for me as a representative of the Higher School of Economics and for our university in general to traditionally host the panel on U.S.-Russian relations. Just one correction, I'm not Deputy Director of the faculty, but I'm Deputy Director of the center within the faculty. There is a very confusing formulation at our HSE website when the bigger institution is put before the smaller institution, so there is an impression thus that I'm Deputy Director of the faculty. No, I'm Deputy Director of the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies, which belongs to the Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs. So, of course, I would definitely, we meet in extreme times. I would prefer, of course, all of us to meet live and offline at our premises. By the way, our premises became bigger over the last several months, and we could have shown some of the new, quite colorful and nice rooms that we now have. It is just the beginning of the Biden administration, and I think it's the first period of US-Russian relations after the end of the Cold War, when the arrival of the new administration is not accompanied even by a rhetoric to an attempt to improve relations. You know, the previous cycle with Donald Trump was accompanied by at least rhetorical statements by both sides that we want some renewal. You know, Donald Trump was talking about getting along with Putin, and so of course nothing came out of it, and the US-Russian relations became much worse, and the US-Russian agenda almost non-existent. But still, at least rhetorically, at least in terms of political will, some, I would say, representatives of the Trump administration, including Donald Trump himself, and some of the members of the Russian government, they did have a political will to try to renew and improve relations. Now, nothing like that on both sides. Also, we meet in extreme times because of what's happening in the United States. Inauguration of Joe Biden was extreme and unique in its own case, and preceded by the storm of the US Capitol, and it is all happening in the context of unprecedented division of American society and polarization of political systems. So we will all discuss, talk about today, among other things, what does it mean? What do these American domestic processes mean for the US-Russian relations? How will they impact the US-Russian relations in the observable future? Also, our today meeting coincides with some protests in Russia, and I just saw from the news that more than 1,000 of Russian citizens were detained throughout the country. So, you know, Russia is also not looking like an island of stability. In comparison of the United States, it is, of course, a continent of stability. But, you know, the problems within the country are fundamental as well, and they will have implications for US-Russian relations. But domestic politics and the impact of domestic politics will not be, of course, the only thing that we will talk about now. We will talk about the general prospects of the US-Russian relations in a new period with Biden administration in the United States, and we couldn't have better experts to discuss these issues because Fyodor Alexandrovich Lukyanov is the top expert on international affairs in Russia nowadays, and Maxim Suchkov and Pavel Sharikov are considered to be the top experts on the United States and the US-Russian relations. I will also make my presentation and conclusion after them. But first, I am very honored to give the floor to Fyodor Lukyanov. Fyodor Alexandrovich, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dima. Thank all organizers for inviting me. It's really, by the way, it's the first discussion after new era has begun in the United States. So it's quite interesting to start this endless, maybe fruitless, but very interesting conversation. So as Dmitry mentioned, I'm certainly not a specialist in Russian-US relationship. We have three brilliant specialists on this issue. So I will limit myself to maybe 3 points about the context of Russian-US relationship, which I believe is maybe even more important than bilateral, the quality of bilateral ties and contacts, because we really live in an extraordinary period, which is not defined by what America is doing, what Russia is doing, what anybody else is doing. It's really a complex shift in the international system, which is a product of trends which started well before Donald Trump, and maybe even earlier than this century began. So we are at the end of extremely interesting and very important period of the post-Cold War world, which has been named in different ways, including this theoretical description as a liberal world order. And this period was certainly a result of how the Cold War did end. But it was not the complete destruction of the whole international system or whole international infrastructure of the Cold War. We don't have time, and we do need to analyze what happened 30 plus years ago. But I think the most important for our issue is that the Cold War period was characterized by the fact that US-Russia, or rather Washington-Moscow relationship, was the absolutely most important element of the international system. That was the core of everything. The Cold War was, in a way, one of the most stable international orders we ever had, very structured, not very pleasant and not very inspiring, but very structured. And after the end of the Cold War, we witnessed a change of that structure, but this change was rather an attempt to extend the ideas, principles, and norms of one side in the Cold War, the side which won, and the rest of the world. It was not something completely new. It was just an attempt to continue to build on the Cold War order, but to adapt it to the new unipolar system. Of course, Russia as a country lost a big part of significance after collapse of the Soviet Union, but still the inertia on the continuation of relationship during the Cold War was a long-lasting heritage of that period. And we saw, despite the weakness of Russia and, on the contrary, the abnormal, I would say, extraordinary might of the United States, we saw continuation of the system when Russia and the United States had an agenda, which, again, despite all differences and despite all changes, could not unify, but create a framework of discussion, create a framework of discussions which were interesting and essential for both sides. This framework had a tendency to shrink, of course, because development after the Cold War was pretty different for America and Russia, and our respective place of world affairs changed differently. But still, it was quite a long continuation of the setup of issues which we used to discuss during the Cold War, and they continued after the end, less and losing significance, but still, and that was quite a long period. Why I think it's important to mention now when we discuss future Russian-US relationship, because now we don't have this framework, we don't have this agenda. It's not about joint issues anymore. By trying to identify those joint issues, I don't mean issues where Russian and American interests are coinciding. It's not necessary. During the Cold War, most of interests were highly contradictory to each other, but still there were areas where both sides knew and understood that they need to work together, at least to minimize risks and to stabilize relationship, to put them in a particular framework of norms and mutually accepted rules. So now I would dare to say we don't have those areas at all. The last one is, of course, arms control, and now we have expectations that Biden administration and the people for Blinken already said it, is willing to prolong New START agreement. Russia has been saying that for quite a long time, so it seems that this thing will be settled. Will it change the nature of relationship? Not at all. And that was also very clearly and very honestly, I would say, mentioned by Mr. Blinken yesterday, when he said that, yes, we want to extend a New START treaty, but that's it. It does not mean we want to improve relationship with Russia. I really appreciate the honesty of this statement, because I think I believe that for quite a long time, and I tried to in my comments here. I always said that arms control cannot be an issue anymore, which can kickstart the new relationship. But now it's but still many people here believe it can. Maybe my colleagues will give arguments for that. But I think what Mr. Blinken said yesterday was a very clear, again, and very, very sincere statement. It's not about improved relationship. It's just to keep this last area maybe just rather symbolic, because for Biden administration, in many regards, it's very important to position itself as anti-Trump. And if Trump was absolutely against arms control, then of course the new administration should be more positive. And also, of course, I think the American colleagues, many of them believe that this is very important to have at least some kind of framework. I agree with that. But the most important thing is it cannot produce anything else. It will be just isolated act of goodwill on both sides. I hope so. But we cannot by far expect an attempt to repeat what Barack Obama did 2010, 2011 with his famous reset policy, when arms control was used as a mean to launch a certain kind of exchange, certain kind of swap, certain kind of bargaining on particular issues. They were connected to each other. It was a clear linkage. United States has had couple of particular interests concerning Iran, for example. Russia had particular interest, and they managed to find a way how to link it and to find a new, again, very limited, but a new framework for discussion for a while. Now, I guess it's absolutely impossible, because we cannot build on arms control anything else. It will be just about that, and that's it. All the rest, we see it from statements given by American diplomats and members of Biden team, and basically we see it on the Russian side. There is not a big interest to try to find something else. with one exception, which I will mention, and we have Pavel Sharikov, who is great specialist on cybersecurity. I think this might be an exception, but it is not a guarantee. So no agenda, no way to try to create a new setup of issues which can be linked and to bargain on that. On the other hand, we have another very important element of this new situation in the world: national interest, in a very concrete, in a very particular sense, very in a sense of interests of people in each country. Those national interests will prevail, and they will overshadow anything but domestic stability, domestic development, and domestic safety. So I mean that both for Russia and the United States, and this is universal for any country in the world in today's situation, which was not created by pandemic, but very much pushed by COVID-19. Physical security, physical safety of people, stability, social stability in each society. Those are issues which will entertain all politicians in all countries, including the United States and Russia. That means that all foreign policy actions, again, it can be applied to both sides. All foreign policy actions will be considered as a way to achieve this goal of domestic stabilization and normalization. And here we will have very different trajectories because situations in the United States and Russia are different. But the most important thing is that means that it will be extremely difficult to find common solutions on anything, because solutions are very much nationalized by societies and states. Talking about US, for example, as we see it from here, I might be completely wrong, but it seems that Biden administration will be back to the whole rhetoric of global leadership, and in this regard will be very much anti-Trump, this liberal order, liberal values, and so on. It doesn't look like in today's world anything can be done to really transform world to something else, because trends are extremely powerful and totally opposite to this liberal idea. Even less so, it's possible to influence or to transform, to change other countries through such rhetorics or policies based on such rhetorics. That's why I believe that Biden administration expectation or wish to be back to this traditional Obama/Clinton period human rights and democracy rhetoric vis-a-vis Russia, this time will have a flat denial here. It was not the case before, because Russian leadership never liked it and was irritated about this. But in 1990s and even in 2000s and beginning of 2010s, Russian leadership paid attention to that and tried to decrease criticism from the United States and from the West. It's not the case anymore. It seems that rightly or wrongly, but the Russian position will be: we do what we want and go to hell with all your lecturing. And that will just increase because of reasons which I mentioned before. It doesn't matter what other people, other countries, other leaders think about us, because of course there is a big part of paranoia about international involvement and so on. But most likely it's not their business, it's our business, and we need to to do what we believe is right, to stabilize this country, to keep it under control and more or less going. And I think it's extremely important, because if Biden administration will try, and certainly they will do, to be back to this narrative of 2000s or the beginning of 2010s, that will have exactly the opposite impact, exactly the opposite. And finally, I think the consequence of what I tried to describe, mutual interest is decreasing. Russia and the United States, in fact, do not care much about each other. Of course, it can be judged differently when we listen to Russian propaganda, which is, by the way, changing as well, but slowly. Or if we read the New York Times or other liberal media in the United States, which put Russia in the center of all evil, and Russia symbolizes a lot of things. That's rhetoric, that's politics, that's about how to how to address domestic issues, I think both in Russia and the United States. But if we look at the real interest, it's uncomparable to what we had before, when Russia, of course, was a very important element of US view, and the US was absolutely the defining element of Russian political view. It's not the case anymore. I was a bit surprised last year when I watched Levada Center opinion poll. It was, I think, in October. Only 11% of Russians did follow US election campaign. 11%. Around 30% heard about that. So the rest was absolutely, they didn't know, they didn't care. And this is a significant drop compared to 2016. And I think that this trend will continue. People are disinterested, and political establishment in Russia, which normally was extremely America-centered and very much paranoid about the United States, paranoia can prevail. That's our national value, so we can keep it. But the real value of a relationship with the United States is not that high anymore, and I guess it will decrease. Some people here, some experts, believe that in the United States, in fact, it will be the same, because looking at the real priorities for the Biden administration, it's not Russia, certainly. Russia might be used as an element of politics. Russia might be considered as an element of political and ideological positioning. But if we look at real challenges to the United States, many of them are much more important than Russian challenge, if it exists. To conclude, I don't believe we can expect anything positive in this relationship to happen. Paradoxically, because we don't care so much about each other, despite the fact that it seems differently. Thank you.
Thank you very much further for your brilliant analysis, and I think it's important to identify those trends. I can't agree more. Indeed, the US-Russian agenda is disappearing, and I don't think it will appear in a traditional way in the observable future. You're absolutely right when you described US-Russian relations as a combination of kind of domestic politics issues and occasional interaction somewhere in the outer world, where we consider the United States as a factor, but not as a partner, be it in the Middle East or in Africa, in Asia, and beyond. I mean, and indeed, I myself participated in a series of US-Russian situation analysis on the Middle East and Syria in particular, where we Russians and American experts were kind of encouraged and pushed by the organizers, and the organizer was the Geneva Center for Security Policy, to find common interest, to identify common interest, and where we can work together with the United States. We both failed. And we said, I mean, Russians and Americans, no, we will not work together. We do not have common interests. We are not partners. I mean, even in the Middle East, and that's very illustrative for the U.S.-Russian relations as a whole. And I also agree that the continuation of the New START is not about U.S.-Russian relations. It's about international security and American soft power. And arms control can no longer be considered as the major pillar of relations. By the way, I'm very skeptical whether we will have some new start or post New START, START 4 in Russia. Probably the New START is the last one of these sorts of arms control agreements. Now, so thank you very much, Fedor Alexandrovich. Now let me give the floor to Maxim Suchkov, who represents MGIMO University. And beyond the U.S. domestic politics and U.S.-Russian relations, he's a very brilliant expert on the Middle East, by the way, in particular. So, Maxim, it doesn't mean that I want you to talk about the Middle East, but anyway, the floor is yours. But please switch on your mic. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Dmitry, because it's an important caveat, because I was not really planning to talk about the Middle East, even though I may mention it. Well, thank you very much for having me on board. It's always a pleasure to be addressing distinguished, I would say, crowd in usual circumstances, but let's say a virtual crowd that's out there, I hope, listening to us. It's a great seminar and a great platform, and I hope, despite all these difficulties in U.S.-Russia relations, the Stanford Forum will maintain its activity. I hate to sound like we're all in a kind of echo chamber, even though I think that happens pretty much when you have a set of think-alikes on these matters. So I'll first perhaps start off quickly on saying that I personally have an extremely grim outlook for what lies ahead in the 4 years of the new administration in the United States. And I think that I would start off by saying I kind of distinguish two components of why things may get bad before they get any better. The general proposition is, I think, that following the 4 years of the Trump presidency, the new administration is coming into office with an idea that the democracy all over the world and in the United States is in danger. And in order to restore these democratic institutions and democracy and itself under American leadership, the administration have to fight both populists in kind of Western community and authoritarian leaders outside the Western community. And of course, by the latter, we mean first and foremost Russian and the Chinese leadership. So this is, I think, is kind of the general trend. And I think regardless of what had happened in Washington over the past several weeks, the relations between US and Russia would have been bad in any case. However, I think we've had a very important moment of this storm in the Capitol that adds a new dynamics to why things may get bitter, in my view. I will reiterate in a way what Fyodor Lukyanov said by saying that the arms control issue that many actually pin their hopes as a starting point in the improvement of US-Russia relations is not going to be such a point. And the reason I think the Biden administration, which I fully echo their sentiment to prolong the START treaty for 5 years, but I think the reason it's not going to be a starting point, because in my reading of the rhetoric from this administration, of the actions regarding the START treaty, it is actually more of an attempt to kind of deal with this issue and set it outside, or take it outside the equation of US-Russia relations, right? So it's no longer going to be a defining element of the relationship for the next 4 years. And I think the reason for that is actually something that Fyodor Lukyanov mentioned in his presentation. I think both actually the United States and Russia are pretty much comfortable with this kind of Cold War paradigm, because for Russia, it is an opportunity to see itself as an equal to the US, and for Americans, it's a comfortable paradigm to see itself as victorious to Russia. So this is kind of at the level of thinking about each other. The Cold War metaphor or paradigm is very helpful for both Moscow and Washington. At the same time, both Russia and the United States think differently about the Cold War, because when Russia talks about Cold War, it mostly thinks about the era of detente, and thinks about the Cold War as a system where rules were set clearly or were at least followed in some manner. Whereas the Americans thinking about the Cold War, and I mean the Americans by the officials, are mostly referring to mentally to the Reagan years, which helped push the Soviet Union outside the brink to this abyss, and helped to its breakup. And the arms control in this area, in this element, the arms control aspect, which was key to the Cold War deal making, is now no longer as important as it was. It is still key to the strategic stability, but it is clear by now that by willing to prolong the START treaty for 5 years automatically, Americans are actually signaling two important things. Number one, that they want a new deal that will involve China, and that's going to be a very difficult process. And the second element, that they want the parts of this new deal be the new Russian armaments. They also want the new deal to include some clauses on short and mid-range nuclear missiles. And most importantly, they don't want the missile defense system of the United States in Europe and Asia to be part of that deal. So to me, it looks pretty much like we're heading for some kind of a deadlock. So even though we may have this treaty prolonged, but we may get stuck for some moment, which I think if we see a Republican administration actually in 2024, it may perhaps even be more difficult for any talks, but it's a long horizon to talk about, of course. So I'm pretty, so for me, the arms control thing, that the prolongation is great, but I don't personally see a lot of movement around it after that prolongation. And then we go kind of to this next level, to this next thematic level of human rights and democracy promotion, which I fully reiterate and agree with Fedor's points, that a lot of these things will be mostly, if not exclusively, for domestic reasons. And here comes this important element of the storming the Capitol, because I think now the need to fight the authoritarian leaders is, of course, America's way, in my view, again, to reboot its own message and reboot its own agenda on human rights promotion and America's leadership in the democratic world. But the key difference to me is when it comes to China, I look at it more as what they call mat wrestling or ground fighting, what we in Russian call борьба в партере. When it comes to Russia, I personally look at it more as a kind of standing game, борьба в стойке, right? So when we're talking about mat wrestling with China under the Biden administration, they will employ perhaps a different approach than that the Trump used, will involve more allies, more institutions, more negotiations, more kind of international mechanisms. And some critics of this Biden policy towards China think it will provide China with breathing space, but it's a separate agenda. I don't want to talk about that right now. But what makes it more difficult for Russia, this kind of standing game, because there are no other issues that the Biden administration would want to talk about with Russia, where there are tons of issues to talk about with China, right, on trade, on climate change, and many other things. On Russia, as my previous as colleagues who spoke previously mentioned, the agenda is really, really limited, if anything. So, and given all these kind of democracy and human rights things that we're talking about, Russia is a perfect kind of example and a perfect target to employ this agenda, right? To restore, to beef off the American leadership, to reboot relationship with the European allies, and all these things, to promote American interests in the post-Soviet space, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and things like this. And this is, of course, a very problematic issue. Usually, Russia deals very clumsily, in a very clumsy way, with the issue of human rights, and most importantly, in the way it usually responds to this criticism on human rights and interference, be it a real one or a perceived one. And here I can see a few crises looming on the horizon, right? In 2021, we have the Duma election. In 2022, we have elections in US Congress. And 2023, 2024 will be pretty much the years defining the future of the presidency, both in Russia and in the United States. So I see very big, very important events domestically for both Russia, for first Russia in 2021, and then the United States, and then for both countries, where this issue of human rights and interference will be really, really big on the agenda. And because Russia has this colossal asymmetry of potentials with the United States, of course, this kind of standing game by above Stoichi is not the one that Russia can afford fighting with symmetric means, right? Obviously, its toolbox for sanctions, information warfare are much more limited. So I fear, and that concerns me a lot, that Moscow may take to this a lot of asymmetric means that Americans in their turn react to in a very clumsy way. And a few things that I fear may also complicate the relationship is the post-Soviet space, which we haven't really heard of in the domestic agenda over the past 4 years. Now it may be kind of getting back to the agenda. We've heard Tony Blinken mentioning prospects for Georgia potentially, joining NATO if they meet the requirements. I can see why that may be a problem, and I've already seen some of the Russian analysts pointed to this aspect as America's way to kind of get back to the Caucasus and balance Russian positions, which are kind of got better after the crisis in Nagorno-Karabakh, and kind of leverage Russian influence in the South Caucasus. It's a big unknown, perhaps, what the Biden administration is going to do exactly in Ukraine, beyond providing lethal arms, which Blinken pretty much outlined as one of the potential steps. But whether it's going to be what kind of American policy we may see in Ukraine is actually an important aspect to how our relations will evolve. And also, I can easily see how Moldova and Belarus can become kind of new fronts for competition or confrontation, even though for the game of denial of each other's positions, right? I'm not saying that the United States cares so much about Moldova or Belarus that they're going to run with a beautiful project that they're going to compete with Russia's integration or stuff. It may be purely a game of denial of each other's policies, maybe not very constructive, but will lead to a new confrontation. And finally, of course, the issue of sanctions. It looks like there have been plenty of them, and it doesn't. Sometimes, when new sanctions are imposed, it's kind of a new norm. We think of it as kind of okay, new sanctions. Somebody got sanctions, but I think there is a really big red. Well, I wouldn't call it a red line because I'm not really in a position to talk about what kind of red lines the Kremlin has. But I think employing sanctions on Russia's energy sector to the way that Iranian energy sector was sanctioned, employing sanctions on Russian state debt, financial institutions, the Bank of Russia. This will be very, very severe, steps with big consequences. Not only because Russia is not Iran and is more integrated into world economy and will have kind of bigger repercussions, including for the United States. We've seen this case with sanction in Rusal that led to big chaos in the aluminium market. But perhaps, and this is something that some of our American colleagues are talking about, who warn the Biden administration against going too far in sanctions, that the Russians, because again, as I said, don't have any symmetric capabilities to respond with, may take to cyber attacks or other kinds of things that will seriously complicate operations of the Americans and potentially lead to more kind of profound crisis in the relationship. So for now, if I were in a position to advise, I would say it's really better to merely minimize the relationship, because there is a moment where the United States is going through a very difficult period in its history, in its domestic politics. There's definitely a moment where Russia is going through some changes in its political system and trying to figure out the way forward post 2024. But I fear that's not the path that both governments will follow. I'll end here.
Thank you very much, Maxim. You know, when you said that both Russia and the United States are quite comfortable with the Cold War paradigm, with the new Cold War paradigm, I immediately recalled the famous phrase by one of the patriarchs, or the patriarch of American studies in Russia, Georgy Arbatov, who said in late 1980s in one of his interviews to the Western journals that we will do one of the worst things that we could ever do. We will deprive you of the enemy, right? And now we can surely say that this problem is resolved. And indeed, I mean, I agree, both Russia and the United States seem to be very comfortable with this hostile image. Depicting the United States as an enemy automatically allows Russia, for instance, to depict Alexei Navalny as a foreign agent, you know, hired by the CIA, and it was even said by Vladimir Putin explicitly and officially, right? And for the United States, also the image of Russia could be useful, and now we see how it is used in the American domestic politics in the United States. So thank you very much. Now I will be very pleased to give the floor to Dr. Pavel Sharikov, who represents the Institute of the US and Canada. Pavel is one of the greatest experts on American domestic politics, on party politics in the United States, and he has just published a marvelous article at the website of the Russian International Affairs Council on the role of the Midwest in American domestic politics, which I advise you to read, especially the Russians, but also Americans. And Pavel is also a very good expert on informational security and cybersecurity. So when Russia was accused of interference into the US elections in 2016, Pavel provided many pieces of very good analysis on that point. So Pavel, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dmitry, for a very generous introduction. I'm really flattered. This is very, very generous. This is very weird Zoom meeting. I see that there are over 30 attendees, but I can't see neither of them. Is that okay? Elena, do you see them?
I don't see. You can see their names, I believe.
Yeah, I can only see their names. I was just wondering, is there any of them wearing the bull horns or a MAGA hat? Or...
No, I got to say I'm pretty sure no.
Okay then. Okay then. And that gives me hope. Right. So, well, I'd start from the elections and then proceed to cybersecurity and mostly the interference problem. I think that the interference problem is one of the most, it is the newest at some point and very, very difficult to resolve. So the November 3rd elections, the United States and American people had to answer a very clear and very important question. Will Trump and Trumpism define the development of the United States for the next 4 or more years? The answer was not quite clear after, at least at first, after a long period of recounts, numerous lawsuits, a few billion tweets, even some protests and an attempt to attack the Capitol. The American people answered that probably not. That was not quite definite answer, but I understand that you were in California. Most likely neither of you were involved in the protests. But I hope these days, 3 days after the inauguration, has been a relief. We already talked with Elena. It was 3 days of calm and stability, which I envy. Anyway, now that Trump and Trumpism are mostly gone, the problems that the Trump administration faced during the 4 previous years will remain and will have to be solved somehow. One of these issues is the problem of interference. So, first of all, let me say that the problem of interference is mutual. The Russian government has been accusing the United States government of interfering into domestic affairs for a much longer period of time than the United States. And there are very specific differences in accusations of Russian interference in 2016 and in 2020. I'm not taking 2018 because there are still very, very unclear things about the interference into the 2018 elections, but the presidential elections And those, activities that were related to Donald Trump personally are of particular interest. So in 2016, we were discussing the very specific forms of interference. In general, there were two major interference cases. One was the hack and leak operation of Hillary Clinton's and Democratic National Committee's emails. And the other one, the troll factory, presumably by Yevgeny Prigozhin, and some political advertisement which was illegally published on social networks through stolen identities and some other forms which are not basically accessible. So whatever happened in 2016 was wrong, was unacceptable, and has to be resolved through cooperative measures, but not unilaterally. These allegations were used many times against Donald Trump during the recent 4 years. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I seen that the threat of Russian interference was sometimes too much exaggerated, and certain American politicians from the Democratic Party were not always as accurate in depicting Russian interference and the threat of Russian interference as it was basically confirmed even by the Mueller investigation and by the intelligence community, and even the Congress investigations. Anyway, in 2020, the problem looks quite different. We didn't hear about any specific actions, at least some sensational things that happened in regard to interference. And Russian interference was rather an environment. It was rather a factor, but not a specific actions which happened. As a result, Russia got a very, very strong, very bad image of a cyber aggressor. I was quite shocked to find some public opinion polls. You know that 67% of Americans consider Russia's interference in 2016 as an attack. And well, following this, having said that, they also approve a retaliation against Russia as a countermeasure against those interference attacks. Over 50% of Americans believe Russia interfered in 2020 elections. And just within a year, from 2017 to 2018, the number of Americans who think that Russia is an adversary grew 10%, from 46% to 55%. So more than half of Americans think that Russia is an adversary. And this is not necessarily of the actions that Russia did, at least proven to do, but basically the general negative environment and general negative image of Russia as a cyber aggressor. Indeed, every other week, if you look American media carefully, you will read a report about Russian hacker captured or prosecuted in Jamaica for identity theft, for robbing the bank, for hacking into critical infrastructure, or doing something else. But these things were not political. These things were basically cyber crimes which happened between all the countries. I was just recently very surprised, when the British court decided not to extradite Julian Assange to the United States. There was reports of other British hackers who were not extradited to the United States, which is very interesting because United States and United Kingdom are very close partners. And you can think that Russian government is always exaggerating the problem about Russian hackers in the United States. But the same thing exists in American-British relations, American-Canadian relations, and all other countries, because cybercrime is basically an international crime and doesn't have any borders. Anyway, we didn't hear any major political interference story in Russian-American relations until the SolarWinds story. And this is very serious because, as I mentioned earlier, this is the first political accusation not related to interference, but related to information operation or cyber attack. So this is not really clear what actually happened. The damage is not also obvious, and not everyone in the United States is attributing these attacks to Russia. Even Biden's, at that time, yet to become the new presidential administration, made a statement where they didn't mention Russia, if I'm not mistaken. And they they made a statement that the cybersecurity is going to be a top priority in the national security, and they will clearly, the Biden administration will deal with the cybersecurity issues and this particular hack in particular. So it is also not clear what was the goal of the attack, because this is very important, whether it was an espionage act or was this an intrusion with the attempt to get remote control, to get, I don't know, to destroy something, to interfere with some processes. This is very, very important and very unclear at this point. But I know that there are investigations going on, and we will probably hear something sooner or later. So whatever was that, the United States would obviously have to implement the cybersecurity strategy. According to the document published by the United States Cyber Command in 2018, the authors of this document mention a number of times a threshold of an armed conflict, and claim that at that point in 2018, there were a number of actors, hostile actors, who were doing some malicious activities against the United States, which they called persistent engagement. If you're into this, you should Google this and read a lot of different very interesting articles about persistent engagement. Anyway, the description of this threshold contains in presumably a classified documents, but logically, whenever a cyber attack overcomes the threshold and becomes over the threshold of an arms conflict, the United States would have to retaliate with a military action. It's also not clear whether this action would be cyber action or kinetic action or a sanction or something else, but this is a threshold which would constitute a state of war between the United States and the offender. So if the worst case scenario, if the United States would come to a conclusion that this hack was executed by Russian government, if this hack was not an espionage, which is pretty usual, I guess, but which was intended an attempt to interfere with some critical national security processes, the United States would have to retaliate, and this is a very, very clearly very difficult and very bad problem for Russian-American relations. I have to say that Trump's cyber policies were a little bit too much focused on the offensive cyber capabilities. And Biden's cyber strategy most likely won't be that much into the military offense. It would be more likely about the military defense. It would be less aggressive. And nonetheless, the investigations of the hackers' attacks would prove that Russia was behind the attacks. We will witness another form of interference and another form of Russian-American conflict. So now about Russia. Remember that I said that the interference problem is mutual. Russian government has been very specific on the interference cases. I can refer to the reports of the Federation Council that contained a very specific cases of interference, which included educational, cultural, research projects, the activities of American NGOs, media reporting, and other things like this, which to my mind look like American soft power and don't have to do anything with a major conspiracy by the US government against Russia. So I'm quite skeptical about these things, but these things are very irritating in bilateral cooperation from Russian side. So based on today's events, and I'm really shocked that there were over 1,000 people arrested or detained, general recent Russian public suppression of civil activities, the issue will get growing and remain a serious problem in bilateral relations. It is also unclear what kind of retaliation would Russia plan against this kind of allegations against the United States. When Biden appointed William Burns to be his director of the CIA, he gave me a little hope because William Burns is a person very, very well known in Moscow. He's very well respected, by the way, and he worked for both, the Democratic and Republican administrations, and had the very top positions. And once he's appointed as a CIA director, there would be a chance for Russian special services to address the issue of interference directly to the CIA. and to probably discuss these kind of things. But during this press conference, New York press conference, President Putin didn't say anything about any cooperative measures in regard to foreign interference. And he said that all the measures aimed at preventing the interference would be focused on Russian domestic audiences, and no cooperative measures are expected in this field whatsoever. So this is why I think that the interference problem is much more than just, you know, the cyber attacks and accusations of some soft power forms of American influence. But this problem is very difficult. It doesn't have any immediate solution, and most likely will persist the Russian-American relations in the coming 4 or more years. So what I think could or should be done in this regard, I have only 3 points. First of all, cooperative measures should be an option as opposed to unilateral activities. And this refers to both Russia and the United States. Whenever United States accuse Russia of doing something, I don't think that Washington should, you know, rush into imposing new sanctions or, you know, make any form of military retaliation. No, every retaliation has to be implemented, has to be imposed after a thorough investigation, a thorough, you know, analysis, bilateral with Russian counterparts about what actually happened. I know that Russian Foreign Ministry was very eager to share certain documents with the American governments when it was related to the 2016 interference cases. And the even Russian government at some point even suggested to publish the diplomatic cables because Russian government was sure that American government was satisfied with Russia's answers. But United States declined this proposition, and later the American Senate Intelligence Committee published a number of reports where they described these forms of cooperation and what, well, they just put a couple of words about what was going on in you know, this cooperative bilateral investigation of the 2016 interference. And they said that Americans were not happy about Russia's answers. So this is very weird and very interesting case. The other thing, the cybersecurity. Russia and the United States had already a very good record of, you know, cooperating on cybersecurity before 2014. In 2013, President Putin and President Obama actually signed a very important agreements on cybersecurity and confidence building measures, which were either, you know, and canceled, either, you know, very limited after the 2014 deterioration of relations. Anyway, I think that in this field, Russia and the United States should seek reciprocal solutions in raising transparency. Probably it would be worth thinking about focusing on the threshold of an armed conflict and forms how to de-escalate in case if there is an attack, which, according to either, you know, both strategies, overcomes the threshold of an armed conflict. Probably it's reasonable to include the cyber element into the arms control agenda. If Biden administration prolongs the New START for another 5 years, that will give us 5 years for negotiating and working out a new arms control agreement, which doesn't have to be necessarily about reductions. It has to be about rules of the road and how to use or not to use certain forms of military technologies. And the nuclear technologies are right now much more advanced than they used to be 10, 20, 50 years ago, as well as space, as well as cyber, as well as hypersonic, many others. 5 years is probably a good time for discussing these kind of things. And the third thing is, I would say that Russia and the United States should refrain from presidential contacts as the principal axis for improving their relations. It is clear that Russian and American political systems are very different. And while the president in Russia has a lot of authorities, you know, American Congress has much more authorities than American president. So, but it would be, and there are no peers of Russian president in American political system and vice versa. So it would be a very important to develop some regional ties and regional relations with American states, with American regions, with American cities, probably, because at this level, Russian politicians are not as toxic as they are in Washington. And the improvement of relations has to be related to legislative branch in the United States much more than the president to president relations. So yeah, let me stop right here. And this is partly why I wrote this piece on the role of Midwest in American presidential, and well, it's not only about presidential elections, it's about elections in general. And I wanted to show how, you know, the slight changes of political sentiments and political preferences on the regional level may be useful for Russian government to somehow you know, not interfere, but find certain allies and find certain partners on the regional level. And interference is, in general, it is a form of, you know, fighting, looking for and finding a political force which would be favorable for the country once it gets to power. And this is, to my mind, a normal form of relations. It may get very ugly, like it happened in 2016, but don't think of interference as something bad just from the beginning. Think of interference as a form of looking for partners, of looking for allies, of, you know, looking for certain connections which may be useful in general. And yeah, let me stop right here, and probably we'll get back to this during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pavel. I fully agree with your assessment and with your analysis that despite the overall gloomy picture of US-Russian relations, there is a necessity and room for selective cooperation. And there are areas where still Russia and the United States should talk to each other. Now I will not speak. I will not give a long presentation because much has been already said. Actually, the majority of what I could have said was already said by the previous speakers, and I agree with them. Just several points. First, I don't think that the US-Russian confrontation will just remain. In the observable future, US-Russian confrontation will intensify. And probably the next 4 years, in terms of the intensity of confrontation, in terms of the political mood and atmosphere, will be the worst for the US-Russian relations after the end of the Cold War. But at the same time, despite the further deterioration of US-Russian relations, I think that with the Biden administration, there will be a greater scope for selective cooperation. This selective cooperation will be not devoted to the improvement of relations and probably not resulted into the improvement of relations. Bilateral selective cooperation will be largely devoted to the management of confrontation and preventing uncontrollable escalation, preventing direct military clash and nuclear war. And here I fully agree with Pavel that cybersecurity should be the issue of negotiations, and there will be some multilateral collaboration where Russia and the United States will work together in broader multilateral frameworks, dealing with the issues like Iranian nuclear issue, North Korean nuclear issues, and some other. What are the reasons for further intensification of confrontation, not just preservation, but intensification of the US-Russian confrontations and further worsening of the political atmosphere? I think there are at least three. First is that Russia will continue to remain an element of American domestic politics and instrument of American domestic political struggle. You know, the difference of scale in terms of Russian accusation in the US elections in 2016 and in 2020 gave me some hope that maybe the instrumentalization of Russia in American domestic politics will decrease under Biden administration. But after the siege of Capitol and the consequent events in the United States, I have to revise my old predictions. And the latest developments prove that Russia will remain and a crucial and one of the central elements of domestic political struggle in the American domestic political discourse. You know, the elections proved that Trumpism is strong, whereas the storm of the Capitol created a chance to destroy Trump politically and to persecute, to undermine, and to weaken the Trump supporters. This is what is precisely being done nowadays. In the United States, the Trump supporters are presented as actually internal enemies. And these policies are much more legitimate. The policies of persecution of domestic enemies are much more legitimate when these domestic enemies are presented as natural puppets, subordinates of the external enemy. And if you follow the current rhetoric by the US elite and by the Democrats, the challenge is presented as inseparable, integral challenge, threat against American democracy, presented by Russia and other authoritarian countries on the one hand, and internal Trumpists, Trump supporters on the other hand, and Trump supporters are presented as kind of subordinated puppets to the external mastermind, which is Vladimir Putin and Russia. So so Russia will, the Russia factor, the Russia challenge, ideological challenge, will remain to be used as a strong and huge instrument of American domestic unification and reconciliation. So it will be largely a reconciliation against. And Russia will be one of those, and the major one. Secondly, the American domestic political system remains polarized, very much polarized, and Republicans, on their hand, will also use foreign policy as an instrument of domestic political struggle. We witnessed it during the time of Barack Obama, when Republicans attacked the US-Russian reset because they wanted to undermine and weaken Obama. So during Biden term, the Republicans will attack Biden administration upon any more flexible step and more, policy that would look like more constructive vis-a-vis Russia in comparison to the foreign policy course that was conducted by the Trump administration. For instance, Republicans already criticized the Biden administration for the decision to extend the New START treaty for the 5 years. And the Republican factor is one of the crucial reasons why Biden administration insists on including China and insists on including non-strategic nuclear weapons into the new post-New START arms control agreement between Russia and the United States. They simply can't afford taking a more flexible and constructive approach without including China and without including non-strategic nuclear weapons. Republicans will simply refuse to ratify any agreement in the US Congress, and that's it. So this is why, for both reasons, because of Democrats and because of Republicans, Russia will remain in part and parcel of American domestic politics, and that will produce a very toxic, impetus, very toxic impact on the U.S.-Russian relations. The second reason for further deterioration is the conviction of the overwhelming majority of those people who now come to the office together with Joe Biden that Russia stole 4 years of their lives, right? That Russian alleged interference resulted in Trump's victory in 2014, and they all became 4 years older, and Russia is kind of responsible for that. Add to that very tense personal relations between Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden, and the overall perception of Russia by such people as Tony Blinken, Andrea Kendall Taylor, Victoria Nuland, Jake Sullivan, and so on and so forth. And you have, again, very gloomy prospects of the relations. And the third reason for further deterioration is that Russia is perceived as a weaker adversary in comparison to China. The weaker adversary, which is easier to defeat, actually, which is easier to bring to the condition when this adversary would be compelled to change fundamentally domestic and foreign policy. And Biden administration in particular will it will not cancel containment of China policy whatsoever, of course, and it will continue and even intensify technological containment of China. But the Biden's rhetoric vis-a-vis China will be much more constructive and positive than Biden's rhetoric vis-a-vis Russia. And Russia will be presented as the enemy number one here and now in the short, in the immediate prospect. So out of that, what kind of policies should we expect? We should expect in the intensification of criticism of Russia over democracy, human rights, support of the Russian liberal opposition, support of Navalny, the Russian NGOs, and so on and so forth, which of course will result into the further tightening of the screws inside Russia. Secondly, we should expect intensification of rhetorical containment of Russia and rhetorical struggle with Russia in the post-Soviet space. The instruments that the United States possess are quite limited, but rhetorically, diplomatically, performing as a spoiler, the United States will intensify their presence there. Right. Of course, Biden administration will consider Ukraine a greater foreign policy priority than the Trump administration did. Probably Biden administration will try to play a greater role in the management of the Donbas conflict. At the part of Ukraine, there will be a new representative of the United States in negotiations over the Donbas conflict, and so on and so forth. And this containment of Russia in the post-Soviet space will, of course, not be limited with Ukraine, but will be total in general, stretching from Belarus and Moldova in the west up to Tajikistan and Central Asia in general in the east. Thirdly, we should expect new sanctions, and some of the reasons were mentioned by Joe Biden himself. When he demanded, when he gave an order to the intelligence community to provide him with the investigation on Russian interference in 2020, you know, the alerts bounties that Russia paid to the Taliban, and so on and so forth. So we should expect new sanctions, which will probably be individual and targeted sanctions, not necessarily structural sanctions, but nevertheless. And also, of course, there will be a more consolidated approach of the United States and the European Union. In general, there will be an increase of the role of ideology of the US foreign policy with the Biden administration, and ideology will be used as a consolidating tool between the United States and its European allies, and confrontational tool between the United States and its adversaries, Russia in particular. And anyway, a greater consolidation between the United States and European Union will reduce the freedom of maneuver of Russian foreign policy towards Europe. And there will be again a synchronization of sanctions policy. by the United States and European Union. You know, originally the US and European Union pursued a very coordinated and synchronized approach during the time of Obama administration. Then there was a desynchronization of sanctions during the Donald Trump period. Now there will probably be a new synchronization, a new coordination of sanctions policy between the US and the European Union, which is, of course, a bad thing for Russia. But nevertheless, I think with the Biden administration, there will be greater space for selective cooperation, resultative selective cooperation, both bilateral and multilateral with the United States, for at least two reasons. Reason number one, unlike Trump administration, Biden administration and Democrats in general do not consider arms race as a preferred instrument of confrontation. Trump administration did. Biden administration and Democrats prefer other tools than arms race, and they're really interested in limiting arms race, preventing arms race, and strengthening strategic stability. And this creates some opportunities. And the second reason for greater scope is more harmony and cohesion within a Biden administration in comparison with the Trump administration, right? There will be a greater unity, a greater coordination between all the leaders of the foreign policy leaders of the Biden administration, and it will simplify dialogue. So, so as a result, where do I see potential for selective cooperation with the United States? Again, not resulting into the improvement of relations, but rather resulting into the greater management of the US-Russian confrontation and multilateral cooperation for the sake of global good. I would say. So first, of course, arms control and strategic stability. Of course, it will be difficult. I completely agree with all the previous speakers. The positions of Russia and the United States over arms control beyond the New START are not just different, but they are contradictory. Right? Russia, as Russia already publicly stated, insisted on addressing all the issues that impact strategic stability, which include missile defense, high precision conventional weapons, weaponization of space, cyber security, and so on and so forth. Right? So Russia focuses on those issues where the United States have advantage. The United States insists on including China beyond the New START and focusing on the non-strategic nuclear weapons, where Russia has 4 times numerical majority in general and 10 times numerical majority in Europe. By the way, focusing on non-strategic nuclear weapons and bringing China, in my Soviet childhood, there was such a game, find 2 differences, right? You are shown, you are presented 2 identical pictures, and the task is find 2 or 3 differences. This is precisely the case with the US approach towards arms control. So what Trump administration wanted originally, already now, Biden administration wants beyond the New START. But in the context, the content is absolutely identical, right? So negotiations over START 4 will be extremely difficult. It is unlikely that it will result in some new legally binding treaty ratified by both countries, but nevertheless the problems are there, right? And we can't afford having a complete vacuum of rules of the game. So probably we should think about a fundamentally new architecture and a new system of rules and agreements, maybe regimes, governing the relations in the strategic realm, which is not only the nuclear realm. Secondly, short and medium range missiles. I mean, this problem is not resolved. The fact that, again, Biden administration does not consider an arms race as a preferred tool of confrontation. And due to the fact that Biden administration will listen to the Europeans more attentively, and Europeans are not in favor of a new full-scale arms race, nuclear arms race in Europe, and repetition of early 1980s. Of course, Europeans, I mean, proclaimed solidarity with the United States on the Russian alleged violations of the INF, but Europeans were not happy when the Trump administration withdrew from the INF treaty. So that at least creates a hope, an expectation that we could negotiate and agree maybe on some regime of non-deployment of those missiles, at least in Europe, with the Biden administration. Third, cybersecurity. Pavel Sharikov already talked about that, so I won't go into details, but I consider that as a hugely necessary, immensely necessary area of cooperation in terms of preventing the worst, in terms of preventing inadvertent war between Russia and the United States, because cyber is a part of strategic weaponry. I already mentioned multilateral dialogues on Iran and North Korea, and where I will probably finish as a area where I see at least interest on the Russian side, or where I think Russia should be interested in having dialogue with the United States, multilateral dialogue, not bilateral, but multilateral dialogue with the United States, is addressing climate and ecological issues in the Arctic. You know, because Arctic is becoming one of the major regions of direct U.S.-Russian confrontation. You know, for the last several decades, Arctic was generally exempt from the great power rivalry, but now, because of the melting of the Arctic ice, because of the opening of the Arctic, it is no longer a buffer, but a power projection region, actually, right? And there is an apparent spillover of the US-Russian and US-Chinese confrontation into the Arctic, the result of which will be further militarization of Arctic, you know, stagnation and stalemate of all the positive developments in the Arctic, and eventually Russia will suffer itself, because Russia is the major Arctic country, and it will be much more difficult for Russia to develop the Northern Sea route, you know, the Arctic infrastructure in conditions of the much greater arms race and much greater confrontation in the Arctic, with the repetitive arrivals of the US military ships in the Arctic, and so on and so forth. So dialogue on climate, from my perspective, is at least provides a hypothetical chance to mitigate that problem of confrontation in the Arctic, you know. And Biden administration is very serious on climate change issues. It is one of the major priorities. In addition to Bill Burns, we have another potential partner, a comfortable partner in the Biden administration, John Kerry, with whom Russia has a very rich experience of cooperation. And John Kerry is the special representative of the US president on climate change issues, right? So here I see a prospect for US-Russian dialogue, again, not necessarily bilateral, but multilateral within the Arctic Council. And this cooperation on the climate issues in the Arctic might mitigate the process of greater confrontation and arms race